From the campus of the University of Kentucky, you're listening to Behind the Blue. I'm Kody Kiser with UK Strategic Communications. Thanks for joining us for this installment of the Business of UK. And once again, we're joined by Dr. Eric Monday. Thanks so much. And we're talking about a pretty big topic this time. We're talking about UK's budget. And so when people hear about this, when they see it in the news and they talk about it, they hear UK's budget is $8.6 billion. And it is kind of daunting and overwhelming, I guess. What do you want people to most understand about what that number actually represents?
Kody, I'm glad to be here with you again and also to talk about this. It's something we get questions about this, to your point, people understand. It's an enabler for how we advance Kentucky. Right. But it's that giant number. And what's it made up of just over 30,000 employees, right? Over 39 or nearly 39,000 students, a healthcare engine that's thriving, a research engine, our athletics department. So first, number one is it is an all-in budget. It is all components of the University of Kentucky is in that 8.6. And I had this whiteboard again. I know you kind of laughed this, Kody, but I kind of like it. But in this whiteboard, so our fiscal year 26 budget. And so when I say fiscal year 26, I'm talking about July 1st of 25 through June 30th of 26. So basically, we're in January. We're about halfway through that budget. We expect to bring in about $8.6 billion, right? It is a plan. That's the other thing. Number two is a budget is a plan based on best available information. Will it be exactly 8.6? No, right? Not any different than probably our own individual budgets, but it's our plan based on months and months of work that came up with this budget and then goes to our board. Our board considers it in June of each year, and they review, and then hopefully what we expect, right, is they approve that. And then once that's approved, then we implement that for the community, for the campus, for the Commonwealth. So that's 8.6. The third thing is I want to kind of take away, how's it broken down? What's it broken into? So we have the UK healthcare, which represents, right? 5/8, let's call it 60% of that budget is in UK healthcare. $5.1 billion is what we expect this year. And that includes all of our hospitals. The hospitals here in Lexington and the hospitals in Ashland. We have a hospital in Ohio, hospital in Moorhead. All of that is in that $5.1 billion. So think about direct patient care. If we're in the hospital, we have a procedure, an overnight stay, that's where all those dollars are brought in, and then they then go and pay for the physicians, the nurses, the supplies, and these are tubs on their own bottom, right? So all the dollars that come into UK healthcare remain in UK healthcare. There's not a state dollar that's going into this. There's no state appropriation for this. So that's that's component one, if you will. Component two of that budget is $3.3 billion of that 8.6 that's in, we just call it the higher ed component of our budget. Let's just call it, for this discussion, just the UK basic higher ed budget. And then we have about $200 million that's in athletics. So if we sum that up, it's $8.6 billion. They're a tub on their own bottom as well. And then when you get into that $3.3 billion, that's tuition. That's what the state provides. That's research that's generated by federal, state, local, community. That's philanthropy. That's kind of, that's the base. If we didn't have athletics and we didn't have healthcare, this would kind of be your base budget. If we were looking at a comprehensive university or an institution that maybe doesn't have athletics or healthcare within it like we do. So that's the breakdown. That's kind of the three top points, at least I wanted to, start with and get across.
When people talk about this, they see things about this in the news, what are the most common misconceptions that you run into that people may have when we're dealing with a number that large?
Sure. Well, one, they think you have all you need sometimes, right. When you have a number that every one of those dollars is being reinvested. Mm-hmm. right? So we are reinvesting that for the Commonwealth. So that's what's paying our faculty. I mean, there's billions of that's going directly to compensation and benefits for our talent. President Capilouto always talks about we need 2 or 3 things for a successful institution: talent, infrastructure, and then innovation. And so that's what that budget allows us to do, is that $8.6 billion. So one, I think sometimes we hear, that's a big number. I'm sure that's enough to do everything. 2 is they don't know how it's broken down, where there's flexibility and where there's not flexibility. And we can talk about that, of course. Of that budget, of that $8.6 billion, another thing sometimes they don't really understand is how much is the state providing. Mm-hmm. Well, in fiscal year 26, the Commonwealth of Kentucky provided in state appropriations $364 million of that $8.6 billion. So maybe the initial response is, well, that's not, that's interesting, right? That's 4% of that $8.6 billion. That's the most important 4% or 4 cents of every dollar.
I've always heard that spoken of in the context of that is the kind of the engine that drives the vehicle.
Yeah.
And you can't go anywhere without that to get you started.
Yeah, and you may remember this, Kody. I think it'd be interesting to show this graphic at some point. But we used to show this little UK truck, mm-hmm. and the engine of that truck, right, was the state appropriation, what the state provides. And so you may have this great chassis, maybe a great looking truck, but you're not going anywhere. So I love that analogy, right? It's so much, that is the engine that spurs everything else. You don't have those 4 cents, you don't generate the other 96.
To explain that for me and people who may be listening to this who are trying to figure that out, why is that such a critical, what does that money do? Why is that such a critical piece to make all the rest of it work?
So those dollars are keeping the lights on, literally, in our academic buildings. I mean, at the core purpose of an institution, right? We are set up to graduate students to go out and lead a life of meaning and purpose, right? To provide them from when they come in day one to when they leave us 4 years later, that they have been transformed, right? That they not are taught what to think, but how to think, that they're exposed to a litany of different ideas and people and strategies and thoughts that they are prepared then to go out and change the world. So that state appropriation is the funding source for that. It's what's paying the English professor, right? It's paying the instructor that you have or the lecturer you have in the first English course, if you will. It's allowing us to build a Whitehall classroom building and to renovate that and to take capital construction dollars and asset preservation from our state to then enhance that facility. So it is the base of who we are and what we do. Have we done things around that? Have we been a steward? I think that the idea to take 4 cents and to generate another 96 is awesome, because it shows that we're a great steward of that. I mean, it's not about, and we're appreciative of every dollar. We're not a place or an institution, and the president has set this direction, that we are going to complain about X or Y. We're going to tell our story, we're going to advocate, and then we're going to appreciate. Our backers, the citizens, appreciate the policy leaders that have so many tough decisions. So that $364 million, though, Kody, has grown. If we look at where that was, 3 or 4 years ago, it was in the 200s. So it is actually the investment from the Commonwealth of Kentucky in the University of Kentucky is getting larger than it allows us then to do more and serve more.
When we're talking about the process of building the university's budget, let's talk a little bit about where it starts and kind of who's involved and what that timeline is like, and how much we have to balance short-term needs with like a long-term strategy.
Sure. And a great question. Number one is, what are our principles? We talk about where we put our money and where we put our time is what we value. And so we ladder up the change, the incremental change from year to year in that budget directly tied to the principles of the institution. So you start with a strategic plan. And we start with, how do we think about putting students first and taking care of our people, inspiring ingenuity, greater trust, and bringing together many people. And so we think about that. And then we've had these enduring budget development principles. I think almost the entire time Dr. Capilouto has served as our president. And there are four things: student access and affordability. So you may say, okay, well, what does that mean when you develop the budget? That means that we've grown the dollars that we provide to students and scholarships that they do not have to pay back to $187 million in this fiscal year 26 budget. If we looked at 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it started at like 50 or 60. Okay, so student access and affordability. Another component of that is how we think about tuition. Last decision we make, not the first. The last decision is, what can we do on tuition? Our last 4 years on average is 2.5% increase. If we look at it a year from now, it's going to be lower than 2.5% because we're going to go up this year somewhere in the neighborhood of between 1.5 and 2 is what we're thinking about as we start that planning. All right, so that's student access and affordability. Number two, competitive pay for our talent. Remember talking about the talent from earlier? And so if you look at how many years we've consistently provided raises, you take COVID out, and 1 year in COVID, almost the entire time that President Capilouto has been president, we've been able to do a compensation adjustment or a Benny's adjustment as well every year. Number three is we plan to prevent against any across the board cuts. Spending, we call that the wrong side of the equation. If we just cut everyone the same in tough times, there's no strategy there. And so we've never done that. We've not had to do any adjustments since COVID, thank goodness. And then lastly, how do we build a community? How do we ensure we're making investments? So to simply how you build it to your question is, what are our principles? And then we start going through the process. Happy to go into that in more detail if you'd like, but the principles is where we begin.
When thinking about the major components of this budget, and you broke it into those three areas, healthcare, the academic enterprise, athletics, and then within the academic framework, you have research, you have extension and statewide services, things like that. How, when you explain this to people, how different are these in terms of like the funding sources? And I know you touched on some of that, but I kind of want to dive into helping people understand why this money is not interchangeable. You can't move from one pool to the other.
Yeah. So you have various levels of funding. We call things like designated and undesignated and restricted and so on. And so just conceptually, rather than breaking it down, in a podcast with, digits and decimals, if you will, just conceptually, the thing that we have the most flexibility on, and that $8.6 billion budget, and this is, you asked me a question earlier, what are people surprised by? Basically, about 7/8 of that budget is protected for individual purposes or how we have received the money. All right, so the federal government provides some dollars to our College of Ag, Food, and the Environment, the Martin Gatton College, for their land grant mission. That dollar then is appropriated to the university, goes to that college, and that dean and vice president works with her team to determine how that's expended, consistent with any rules and regulations. So that there's not a flexibility for someone else to come take that dollar and say, no, we're going to do it for something else. A grant's a great example. A philanthropic gift is another great example. So Kody provides $25,000 to the journalism program. It then creates a $1,000 scholarship because it's endowed 4% every year. And you want that to go to a journalism student who wants to lead podcasting in the future. Well, that is restricted. It's functional. It has to be appropriated or then given to that student in that. A research grant, we submit a grant application to do A, B, and C. We receive that. Then we have to do A, B, and C. healthcare, right? We may get a reimbursement in healthcare from Medicaid or from Medicare or from an insurance company. And that comes in to help compensate and pay healthcare for the care provided to the person who's insured, whether they're on Medicaid, Medicare, or a private health insurance. So we call that, in some ways, I like the term matching, right? We're matching a revenue and expense. So there's not as much flexibility, if at all. You have to use it within that. So once we look at healthcare, philanthropy, research, grants, gifts, and contracts, athletics, and everything that's a tub on its own bottom, you're basically left this in fiscal year 26 with about $1.1 billion. That's how much the state provides, that state appropriation we talked about, how much we generate in tuition. And then we have something that we call other, that's about $90 million, which is how we invest our money and generate some returns on investments, how we charge units called service assessments. So if athletics needs 3 people in payroll to run their payroll, they reimburse the university for that. But that $1.1 billion, we call that the undesignated general fund budget, is what we have the most flexibility, what the president and the team look at each year, present that in detail to the board, and then that is then pieced through and evaluated, and then if approved, then is allocated. So 7/8 is for a functional effort or purpose. About 1/8 roughly, Kody, is what you have some level of flexibility on.
How does how do external factors like volatility in markets or things happening at a federal or state level ripple through the budget sometimes, and how do we kind of approach that? Because sometimes grants, the nature of them change, Medicare, Medicaid, healthcare funding, capital funding, some of those things ebb and flow. So how do you kind of navigate that kind of the shifting ground as we go through year to year?
I think two real examples, if you think about the national conversation just in the last 6, 12, 18 months. So let's talk about two. One is Medicaid. So the reconciliation bill that I believe was signed July 4th last year has tremendous impacts on the Medicaid program and what is going to be changing. And in some components of that program are going to phase out some reimbursement strategies. And maybe we should do a follow-up podcast just on this, because it would be, I think, valuable to talk about that. But that reimbursement strategy for Medicaid and providing services to Medicaid patients is going to sunset by about 2037. And so how do we then, so we advocated to tell the story. The policy leaders made a determination they thought was best. And now how do we react to that? But that's a real life example of hundreds of millions of dollars that over the next 12 years is going to come out of the healthcare budget. And we've taken the position that we are going to grow out of that. We're still going to serve the patients. How are we going to do things differently, become more efficient, grow revenues, grow services to overcome that? So that's one example. Another example is, and I think the first example in some ways may be more permanent, where the second example I would think is more temporary. And temporary doesn't mean 6 or 12 months. It may mean the next few years, but federal grants. And so we had a really nice trajectory. If we just look at, let's say, fiscal year 16 to 25, went from roughly $300 million in grants to over $500 million in grants. Between fiscal year 25 last year and this year's budget, we actually expect in this year budget that the grants could go down by as much as 7 to 8%. Understanding the national conversation, what's happening at the federal government and the funding level. And so we saw that possibly coming. I think we're overperforming on that about 6 months into the year. They're not going down as much as we thought, but we planned for that, put that into the budget. So our responsibility is, when we have knowledge of it, right? That plan needs to be updated to account for that knowledge. And at the same time, if something happens within that fiscal year and we're going to generate more revenue than we thought we were going to generate, for example, we go back to our board, the Board of Trustees, for a budget adjustment throughout that fiscal year as well. So just because we start on July 1st with an $8.6 billion budget, we could adjust or modify that throughout the year with board action, and it could go up or go down.
We've talked a lot in this series about partnerships and how partnerships, I want to talk a little bit about how partnerships factor into the budget, from what makes a partnership work for the university with long-term planning, capital investment, things like that. And I think probably you could argue that the biggest, most obvious example of partnership would be kind of our infrastructure on campus, where we've had a lot of physical development and change of campus. But talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I think we see great partnership from the state. And when you think about the capital budget, so the infrastructure budget, which uses sticks and bricks, if you will, right? If we think about that, the state is providing $250 million of state funds to support the health education building. It's about a $425 million roughly project. $250 million is coming into that project that doesn't have to be paid back, right? So that facility, which is going to grow our College of Medicine, our College of Nursing, College of Health Sciences, in College of Public Health, would not happen, would not be under construction right now, opening in December of 26, January 27, if it wasn't for that support. You see some of that from the federal government. There's some conversations right now that are going on in Washington, where, in fact, I think there's a recent press release from Senator McConnell where he is supporting as much as $65 million in federal dollars that are going to go into the Healthy Kentucky Research Building. That's the second research building. We've outfitted the first one. We want to build a second Healthy Kentucky Research Building to get ready for research to come back in the coming future, in the coming years. So that's on kind of that federal and state side. And then if you look at what we would call our public-private partnerships, we use a broad definition for that. We have received support to build a baseball stadium, right? We wouldn't have the baseball stadium, Kentucky Proud Park, without one of our partners in their support. Our housing, clearly, we're about to open the 14th or 15th building here next year. We wouldn't be in a position to do that without partnerships. So in some cases, it is true equity. In some cases, it's a gift. In other cases, it's working with us to build something less expensive and faster than we could otherwise build it.
I think looking at the state contribution and the state partnership there, I think that goes to show there's that clearly, as time has gone on and we move into the future, our population is aging and our healthcare needs are becoming more and more important and a greater kind of need for Kentuckians. We see that, but also our state legislature sees that, and they're working very hard to address that and working with us. And so I think that seems like a good example of that. When we talk about the budget and we talk about transparency, we're a public land grant institution. It's important for us to be transparent with our budget in an effort to be accountable to the Commonwealth. Why is that so important, and what do you think we need to do in order to get that message across and make sure that transparency is there?
Absolutely. And we recently launched, just in the last few days, a new website around that tenet of our strategic plan, one of those principles we talked about earlier, Kody, of looking at ensuring greater trust, transparency, and accountability. And so having that information, we've done a pretty good job over the years And your team and Jay Bland's team, a number of others have done a good job of getting the message out. But sometimes, the great thing about the web is having things in one place and bringing things together in one central way in which I then can go to 50 or 70, if you will, different places. And so having one page that talks about, where the dollars are going, or talking about, we've got some questions around travel. We're going to put the travel of certain senior executives out every quarter now. We've gotten questions on the budget. So the entire budget is available online. The entire document is in a PDF. We need to make sure that's linked from that transparency website as well. And so it's more is more. So we got to do more. I think this podcast series helps us in a lot of ways, and taking some of the behind the blue and doing things which we've done, I think, in previous times as well. But we have to be more out there with this information, telling the story, being prepared to answer questions, and at the same time, making it easy to access. So I think, great question. I think you should expect, right? We should all expect us to continue to figure out ways to do more within that responsibility we have.
If there's one thing that you hope listeners can take away from this conversation about the budget, what would it be?
It is a budget that is based on the institution's responsibility to advance Kentucky. And so that slide we have, which we can make sure is easily accessible, that looks at our investments. Remember, let's zoom back for a second. If you can impact 1/8 of a number, that 1.1 billion of that 8.6, what are you doing to impact that? And does that ladder up to those principles, and how do you do that? So that's one of my favorite slides in the entire deck of how we are investing in our colleges. So the action happens closest to the students, and that's in our academic colleges. And so over the last few years, we've invested over $100 million directly back out. This is in addition to funding pay raises directly to our colleges. And I do think at a future show, we should talk about what we call the financial allocation models. And those are ways in which colleges that do more and serve more receive more, a meritocracy of how they can generate. So I want folks to take away that this is built based on an outcome of how do we advance Kentucky. And we do that in a blend of short, medium term, and long-term decisions that ensure that we're financially stable, that not only can we do it in 26, but we got to be in a situation to do it in 31 or in 36. And so to me, that is what we've been able to achieve, and what is our commitment that we're going to continue to be able to do in the future.
I know we've looked back. You've mentioned the things that we have done with our budget in the time that Dr. Capilouto has been here. But looking forward, if you think about 5 or 10 years down the road, what do you feel most optimistic about?
There is a base of support from our Commonwealth that I believe we can sustain and likely grow, that allows us to generate a multiplier over and above what we've done previously. Because the number in and of itself is worthless, right? It's what you're able to do with it. And this Commonwealth needs an institution and needs a higher education system that is providing students across the stage to solve the workforce needs of the Commonwealth, to help grow the Commonwealth. At its base, the Commonwealth of Kentucky has to grow. We can't be 4.3 or 4.4, right? We have to grow into the 5s and the 6s as millions of people. Higher ed is a component of that growth. The University of, for, and with Kentucky is a component of that growth. And we're going to continue to invest those dollars so we can serve more and do more for Kentucky. That, I believe, then helps to support an ecosystem and infrastructure that Kentucky can grow. And that will be better for our kids and their kids as well.
Excellent. Is there anything I haven't mentioned or we haven't touched on that you want to put out there before we wrap things up?
I think one other thing I think about when I think about the University of Kentucky is let's just for a moment pause and think if we were a corporation. We're not. And I think sometimes people maybe recoil at that term in some ways. I'm not sure that's the right approach, but I think sometimes people do. But let's just think about if we were $8.6 billion of revenue. We had, over 30,000 employees, keep in mind in all 120 counties, right? So across the entire Commonwealth. You had, customers, let's say students a customer for a moment, of 39,000 customers in our student business, over 71,000 customers that have to come to us in a healthcare setting and get discharged. So these are inpatients, a couple million visits by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of individual customers, an athletics department that is watched by millions of customers in the Commonwealth and beyond. And think about us that way. What would we do to recruit that as a corporation to Kentucky? What would Tennessee do to recruit that, or Alabama do to recruit that? And I always think that's just an interesting evaluation to think about. If you have 30,000 employees, and Kody, you know what? We have a way where we're going to try to get to 35 to 40,000 employees in the next few years because we know we need to do more and serve more. I think that's an amazing investment. And I do want us to always be seen as a steward of those resources, but also as something to invest in that's going to generate a return, more graduates, healthier patients, a healthier Commonwealth, an athletics department that gives us pride and a soul and a tie to our community. And I think that's an interesting way to look at the University of Kentucky. And I would encourage people to think through that and how we are that steward that has a great return that leads to that improved life.
Fantastic. Well, Eric Monday, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this. I appreciate you for joining us for this installment of the Business of UK as part of the Behind the Blue podcast. If you have questions that you'd like answered about the Business of UK, you can email businessofuk@uky.edu. So again, Eric, thanks so much for taking the time, and we will have another installment and talk more about this stuff in the future.
Thanks, Kody.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Blue. Behind the Blue is a production of the University of Kentucky. For more stories about how the University of Kentucky is advancing our Commonwealth, visit uknow.uky.edu.